Have you ever wondered what happens when nature's fiercest creatures face a life-or-death struggle? Picture this, a blinding blizzard, hikers braving the elements, when they spot something extraordinary, a lynx, struggling to survive. But what's inside her den leaves the vet pale with shock. This isn't just a simple rescue mission, it's a fight against the odds. Most would leave, but not these brave souls. What would you do if you were in their boots? In moments like these, every second counts. While others might run, they stay and risk it all. Because sometimes, the real heroes are the ones who refuse to turn away. What would you do if the wild needed you most? Hi everyone, welcome to our channel. Today, I'm excited to share a new story with you. Please subscribe us. A thick blanket of snow covered the wilderness as a sudden blizzard swept through, engulfing everything in a swirling mass of white. Visibility was nearly impossible, the cold biting at the skin and numbing the senses. Despite the storm's fury, the hikers pressed forward, their breaths visible in the frigid air, each step sinking into the deep snow. Then, through the storm's chaos, they saw it, a shadow moving against the blizzard's fury. A lynx. Its sleek, tawny coat was barely visible against the whiteout, but its sharp, piercing eyes locked onto theirs as it pushed through the snow with determined strides. The wildcat's graceful movements, even in the harshest conditions, struck the hikers with awe. They had read about lynx, heard whispers of their elusive nature, but seeing one in person, fighting against the elements with such strength, was something entirely different. The hikers exchanged glances, uncertainty in their eyes. Should they approach? The lynx's beauty was mesmerizing, but the storm was unforgiving, and there was something about its struggle that unsettled them. Slowly, the pull of curiosity grew stronger. What was it doing out here? And why, despite the storm, was it not retreating to shelter? The mystery deepened as concern began to take root. The hikers pushed through the snow, their steps growing slower as they approached the dense cluster of trees. It was then that they spotted it, a small, secluded den nestled against a snowbank, its entrance barely visible beneath the weight of the storm. The lynx had taken refuge there, its sleek coat blending almost seamlessly with the surroundings. The creature was still, but its eyes were wide and alert, locking onto the hikers as they neared. They instinctively paused, sensing something wasn't quite right. The lynx's body language was tense, its tail flicking nervously, its ears twitching at every sound. Normally elusive and solitary, the lynx seemed more agitated than they had ever seen in the wild. A low growl rumbled from deep within its throat, a warning to keep their distance. The hikers exchanged worried glances, sensing the urgency in the lynx's behavior. Something was off. They couldn't see inside the den, but the protective stance of the lynx and the way it shifted uncomfortably made them uneasy. It wasn't just seeking shelter from the storm, it was hiding something. A fleeting glance at its rear suggested a sign of distress. It was clear they needed help, and fast. Without hesitation, one of the hikers pulled out a satellite phone and dialed for assistance. "Get Dr. Rivers. Now." The voice was sharp, filled with the gravity of the situation. Minutes later, the storm howled louder as Dr. Ethan Rivers, the wildlife vet, arrived on the scene, his figure a stark contrast against the swirling white. He surveyed the situation with a practiced eye, his brow furrowing as he noted the lynx's uncharacteristically defensive behavior. Something was wrong, but what? The sense of urgency was palpable, the storm was worsening, and time was running out. Dr. Rivers crouched low behind a thick cluster of snow-covered bushes, his breath forming a mist in the frigid air. His sharp eyes scanned the area with precision, peering through a pair of binoculars as he observed the lynx. The storm howled around him, the wind whipping the snow into a blinding whiteout, but his focus remained fixed on the feline. The lynx stood by the den's entrance, its body tense and alert, eyes locked onto the approaching figures with fierce, unblinking intensity. Dr. Rivers could see the protective stance, the low growls that rumbled from its chest as it took small, wary steps toward the den. It was as if the creature was trying to shield something, though it was hard to tell what. The vet's brow furrowed. This wasn't the usual solitary and aloof lynx behavior he had come to expect. There was more going on here, something deeper. After a long moment, he lowered the binoculars and turned to the hikers. "Something's not right," he muttered under his breath, eyes still fixed on the lynx. "Do you think it's injured?" one of the hikers asked, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. Dr. Rivers hesitated, his gaze narrowing as he peered through the binoculars again, trying to get a clearer view of the inside of the den. Then, he saw it, a small movement inside the den, barely perceptible through the snow and darkness. He adjusted his position for a better angle, his stomach tightening. What he saw next was enough to send a chill down his spine. Inside the den, a shape stirred. It wasn't just the lynx that the animal was guarding, it was a small, fragile form, barely moving. A cub. Dr. Rivers' heart sank. The cub was impossibly small, far too small to be out in the harsh weather. It was lying motionless, its thin body barely visible beneath the snow. The fur that should have been thick and protective appeared patchy and sparse, exposing pale, nearly translucent skin underneath. His mind raced. This cub was in serious trouble, but it was clear that the lynx wasn't about to let anyone near it. The wind howled louder, and the storm grew fiercer by the second, the temperature plummeting. Every instinct in Dr. Rivers told him to act quickly, but the risk of upsetting the lynx's already defensive nature weighed heavily on him. He had seen animals in distress, but this? This was different. The lynx wasn't just a mother, it was a wild creature, fiercely protective of its young. Any wrong move could escalate things to a dangerous level. The lynx let out another low, threatening growl, its teeth flashing in the dim light. It was clear the animal was not backing down. Every muscle in its body was taut, its eyes filled with primal protection. Dr. Rivers couldn't afford to wait any longer. He took a slow, deliberate breath and turned to the hikers, his voice steady but grave. "We need to get that cub out of there. If we don't act now, it won't survive the storm." The hikers exchanged uneasy glances. There was no turning back now. Dr. Rivers looked back at the den, his mind racing through his options. He could approach cautiously, hoping to keep the lynx calm, but there was no guarantee it would allow him anywhere near the cub. Or, he could take a more direct approach and risk everything in the hopes of saving the tiny animal. He made his decision. Without another word, he started toward the den, his movements slow and deliberate. The lynx hissed sharply, its body low and coiled as if preparing to strike. The storm raged on, but Dr. Rivers knew time was running out. As Dr. Rivers moved cautiously toward the den, his eyes never left the lynx, which stood poised at the entrance. Its growls were low, but the aggression was palpable, a stark warning that no one would be allowed near. Each step Dr. Rivers took was deliberate, calculated. One wrong move could trigger a devastating reaction. The storm was deafening, the wind whipping through the trees and howling past, but inside the den, there was a strange stillness. The lynx's growls were the only sound, their intensity increasing as the vet edged closer. He could see the creature's muscles tensing, its fur bristling in the bitter cold. It was like a standoff between two forces of nature, the calm determination of the vet and the primal instinct of the lynx. Finally, Dr. Rivers was close enough to see into the den. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, but it wasn't what he expected. Instead of a cub curled up, safe and sound, there was a much smaller, frilier form, barely recognizable as a lynx. It was impossibly thin, its limbs twitching weakly in the cold. The fur that should have been thick and protective was sparse, revealing pale, almost translucent skin beneath. The cub's chest barely rose and fell, a faint, shallow breath escaping with each labored inhalation. Dr. Rivers froze. The lynx, instead of attacking or retreating, stepped aside. The gesture was subtle, almost reluctant, but it allowed him a brief moment of access. The vet's heart pounded in his chest as he reached forward, his hand trembling. The lynx watched, its gaze intense but not overtly hostile, like it was waiting for something, or someone, to make the next move. The moment felt surreal. Dr. Rivers could feel the lynx's anxiety radiating from its body, but the animal's instincts seemed to know that its cub needed help. Still, the vet understood the fragile balance at play. One wrong move, one sudden shift, and the lynx would strike out to protect its young. Dr. Rivers knelt beside the cub, his pulse quickening as he gently assessed the small creature. A horrible realization hit him: the condition was worse than he feared. The cub had a rare infection, one that could easily become fatal without immediate intervention. He didn't have much time. His mind raced, calculating his options. He had to act fast, but he couldn't risk startling the lynx. The stakes were higher than ever before. With steady hands, Dr. Rivers prepared to address the cub's condition, fully aware that each second counted, and so did every breath the lynx took. As Dr. Rivers knelt next to the fragile cub, his heart pounded. The storm howled louder, but the world around him seemed to still, as though time had slowed. His eyes never left the small, frail form in front of him. The cub's chest barely rose, its thin body hardly moving. It was clear this cub was fighting to survive, and without help, it wouldn't last long. The lynx, though tense and wary, had stepped aside enough for him to get a closer look. Its golden eyes followed his every move, filled with a fierce protectiveness. Despite its usual solitary nature, it seemed to recognize that the cub's survival depended on immediate help. But the vet knew that even the smallest misstep could provoke the lynx into defending its young in the most violent way possible. Dr. Rivers took a breath, his hand steady as he gently scooped the cub up, cradling it carefully in his arms. The lynx growled low, its body language growing increasingly defensive, but it made no move to strike. Dr. Rivers slowly rose, backing away to a safer distance, the cub's weak breath still warm against his chest. Every instinct told him to run, but he couldn't. He had no choice now. The cub had to survive. He quickly radioed for assistance, knowing they needed to get the cub to safety and start treatment immediately. The situation was dire, and the lynx's protective instincts were still unpredictable. As he retreated, Dr. Rivers couldn't shake the thought that what had just happened, what he had witnessed, was nothing short of miraculous. The lynx had allowed him to intervene, to take its cub away from the storm. Something deeper had shifted in that moment, and Dr. Rivers knew he would never forget it. After hours of delicate care, Dr. Rivers and the team had managed to stabilize the cub. It wasn't clear yet whether it would make it, but for the moment, it clung to life. Its breath was still shallow, its body frail, but there was a flicker of hope. The storm raged on outside, but inside, the tension in the room was palpable. Dr. Rivers carefully placed the cub back in the den, his eyes never leaving the lynx. The moment he did, the room seemed to hold its breath. The lynx stood motionless, its gaze fixed on the cub, and for a long, agonizing second, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the lynx approached. Its nose hovered over the cub, sniffing gently, testing for the familiar scent of its young. The silence was thick, but then, finally, the lynx let out a soft, relieved sound. It nuzzled the cub tenderly, licking its fur with the same affectionate care it had shown before. The team watched in awe, each breath a quiet exhale of relief. They had done all they could to save the cub, but now, the bond between mother and baby had been reaffirmed in the most natural, profound way. As the storm began to clear, the team stood outside the den, watching the lynx and her cub. The tranquil image of them together lingered in the air. In that moment, all the worry, the uncertainty, and the fear dissolved. There was no greater testament to the wild strength of nature and the power of a mother's love. If this story touched your heart, hit the like button and subscribe to our channel.